Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight we're going to be heading to the horrors that can happen while being home alone. So get comfortable, because it's time to let the darkness take control. Back when I was 13 at my old house, we had this really old man as our neighbour, and he lived across our street. He was the typical angry old man. He would yell at loud cars driving past, tell people to get off his lawn and stuff. A few months of living there though, he started watching me a lot, like whenever I sat on the front porch or sat visible in my bedroom window. I was on the second floor facing the street, bed pressed against this huge window facing where his house was. One day my family decided they were going out, but I didn't really feel like it, so I decided to stay home. It was about midday. I was fine for the first 30 minutes. I scrolled TikTok, watched some YouTube before I heard a series of loud knocks coming from the front door. Now I'm not dumb. I know not to open the door when my parents aren't home, unless I'm expecting someone over or getting food delivered. Needless to say, I was confused. Anyway, I walked out of my room to the top of the staircase, which is at the bottom of where my front door is, and stare for a moment before I heard the knocks again, somehow louder this time. I quickly retreat back to my room in fear while the knocking continued. I peeked out my window to see the old man and one of his friends standing at my door, having a conversation while almost pounding his hand into my door. I was terrified to say the least. I put 000, and in Australia, that's our version of 911. I punched it into my phone, ready to call if he broke down the door. After a few minutes of being frozen at the top of the stairs, watching the door shake with knocks, I slowly retreated downstairs, crying when my stairs were creaking, afraid he would hear me. I tiptoed to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest kitchen knife we owned, before quickly and quietly returning upstairs, shutting the door behind me and putting my desk chair below the handle. I messaged my boyfriend at the time, freaking the hell out, calling him, crying and shaking. The knocks were so loud at that point, I had hidden myself in my wardrobe, thinking he was close to breaking in. They continued for another hour, all the while I was silently sobbing onto my phone. They left the door just before my parents arrived. I told my mum everything, but she told me I was exaggerating. But needless to say, I kept the knife in my room under my pillow just in case. The older guy did that on at least 20 other occasions when I was home alone. Either he would see me come home from school, or watch people leave home without me. Whatever it was, I was always alone when it happened. After a few months, I convinced my parents to let us move. I complained about fake things, odors, bad area to live, etc., so we would just leave. I haven't seen that man at all since, even though we only moved to the other end of town. But Jesus Christ, it was some of the scariest stuff I ever experienced. I own pocket knives and keep them in my bedside drawer because of that. But yeah, I don't trust any old men that live on my street anymore. When I was in 3rd grade, my mum and dad were getting a divorce. We, my mum, younger brother, and 3 younger sisters and I, all moved to my mum's home state and into a small 2-bedroom trailer out in the countryside. My mum was dealing with some emotional issues and drinking a lot, leaving us home alone most weekend nights. We would always hear scratches from the side or footsteps outside. We mostly assumed it was tall weeds or animals wandering around at night. One night it was relatively calm outside, and my mum had gone out drinking, leaving me to take care of my brother and sisters. We all sat in the living room watching movies on tapes. Suddenly we heard the back door open and slam shut. We all stood up and slowly made our way towards the back half of the trailer. My brother and I stayed ahead of the group, and we peeked into the short hallway that led to our bathroom and bedroom. The light was off, and we were too scared to walk the few feet into the darkness to flip the switch on. Being horrible siblings, we tried and failed to force my younger sister to take a peek. I managed to build up the courage to take a few steps towards the light switch. Then I saw something move. It took a step back, and my siblings huddled around me. I held my breath, and something took a few steps out of the darkness. It looked like an alien. Stereotypical with the big head, oversized eyes, small mouth, and small stature. We all screamed and ran into the living room and heard the door slam and shut. We stayed up pretty late that night, and after a period of time we went and checked our bedroom and the bathroom, but didn't see anything. The back door wouldn't lock for some reason, and so we found some string and tied it to keep it closed. My mum showed up sometime in the middle of the night and found us all asleep in the living room. She was pissed. I explained why, but of course she didn't believe us. I don't know why, but I'm the only one who remembers seeing what it looked like. Everyone else remembers being scared, or something that came inside our home. But what exactly it was, they can never say. One night in my house out in the country at 1 a.m, I was doing some dishes. Over the sink in the kitchen is a window that overlooks a wooden patio in the backyard, and about 5 feet away from the sink and window is a large sliding glass door to get out onto said patio. The window over the kitchen was open, but the patio door was not. It was so dark outside, and on the other side of the window screen was pure darkness. I had minimal lights on in our kitchen, but nevertheless one could definitely see my head and face in the window looking from outside. I reflected on this thought in silence, when directly ahead of me, about 10 feet of distance, I hear a cell phone ring. I freeze and stare out into the blackness of the outdoors. The cell phone continues to ring, concealed in its distance from me, but clear in its proximity. It rang maybe 3 times before slowly I hear the creaking of patio wood. One footstep, then another, then another. It was the sound of footsteps walking away from the patio slowly and onto the grass of my backyard. I heard the soft but threatening footfalls on my lawn, and the cell phone rings growing slowly fainter and more distant. Then at what seemed like at the edge of my property, the cell phone was stifled mid-ring. Silence. Silence as I stared into nothing. A nothing that was not only probably staring back at me, but I suddenly realized with horror it had been staring at me for an hour without my knowledge. I never knew before how close I was to being robbed or worse. Around the age of 8, I received a protection present from my mum, a German Shepherd. She was a giant, fuzzy fluff ball of black and brown, which I named Kibbles. As a kid, I grew up knowing my mum had to go out on call-outs, which is basically being on call after your shift, like a doctor. Mind you, this was back when pagers were a thing and cell phones weren't necessarily a thing, since cordless house phones were still around at the time. If you don't know what a pager is, well, I feel old. These call-outs that she had to go on could last anywhere from a few hours to even a few weeks, depending on how bad the crime was, the evidence involved in the case, and if she had to testify, as well as the location. Occasionally she would have to travel across the state to get to her destination. When I was younger, she would just leave me with family or friends. But once I got older, I was able to stay home alone by myself with the assistance of a few phone calls through the night, especially if it was a one-night job, which meant that it was local and not a big case. We were always cautious if she had to leave, and especially in the middle of the night. We'd make up some special knocks and code words that we would give out to certain people at different times, so they would always change for each call-out. Never hurts to be prepared or cautious, I suppose. Even today, I use a secret code word and knocks with my 2 little ones for an added layer of protection. On this night, I was snuggling with my then 3-year-old fluff ball in my living room, with the lights off around midnight. My mum had to go to a single night call-out that was local, so she had our neighbour keep an eye out for me, and would call every few hours just to check in. I would always call my mum before bed as well, to let her know the house was locked up. She was very cautious when it came to having to leave her child in the middle of the night. It came with the job territory. I remember there was a Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees movie marathon since it had been close to Halloween, and I lived directly next to the water. Even though I was hiding under my blanket, any scary part and I would do the in-between the fingers thing. As a kid, I was worried that Jason would get bored at Crystal Lake and would come to mine. Imagine, the fog rolls over the water. Suddenly, while it's dark, all you see is this dark, shadowy figure coming out of the water for new prey. Yeah, I was terrified. But I kept watching the movies anyway, just to give myself that little adrenaline boost. Around 3:30 in the morning, I began to hear a tapping noise on the side of my house, directly behind my head on the couch. I was backed into the furthest corner of the living room, away from the windows. The sound lasted roughly 15 seconds, and Kibbles perked up, only to start growling quietly, it getting louder as time went on. She never left my side on that couch, even as the sound started to move around the house. At this point I'm thinking Jason's coming to get me, and I've got nowhere to go. I grabbed the remote, muted the TV, and grabbed my cordless house phone and began calling my neighbour. By this point Kibbles was in full ground mode, tail puffed out in anger, but not knowing what the actual threat is. We just knew that the noise was heading back towards our back porch near the sliding glass door. The outside had motion lights, but they would go off so much due to random animals that I always just brushed it off. That was until the light turned on, and the tapping noise was on my living room window, directly to the left of the sliding glass door. Now, the panic has sunk in, and the nausea slowly started. Thankfully, my neighbour answered their phone on the second ring. As quietly as I could, without my hand shaking and the pup growling fiercely, I explained the situation. She told me to stay low to the ground, get to the kitchen since it was on the way to the bedroom, grab a sharp object. Cliché moment, I picked up the longest knife I could find and lock myself somewhere safe until she was able to check the perimeters. The hardest of all this? Getting Kibbles from the door long enough to follow me back to the room, to get locked in without crying and panicking. She was purely committed to the idea that she was going to get whoever or whatever was out there. My neighbour wasn't hesitant in slamming open her front door and began running around the property. Eventually she went to the glass doors in front so I could see her, and she gave me the code word with the special knock, so I let her in. She told me she couldn't find anyone or anything around the house that had been the cause of the tapping. There had not been any wind that night, and no animal could make the noise the tapping made. Due to my puppy, we ended up staying at my house, lights on, and locked in the back room until it was morning, when we would call my mum to let her know what happened. I never did find out what happened that night, and the tapping never came back after that. My neighbour and mum couldn't explain it. I guess it would just be a mystery, and I'm completely okay with that. 2 years ago, I lived in a house that had a terrace and a small parking lot a meter below the terrace. My room was upstairs and there was a door to the stairs that could be locked. I live in the south of France with my stepfather and mother. I was playing in my room, Minecraft, when I looked towards the left towards the window. That's when I see a man standing there with a balaclava staring into my window. There's an object in its hand, but I didn't notice what it was. I get stressed and warn my mother and stepfather, totally panicked. They locked all the doors, and it takes me a while to sleep to forget about the situation. Weeks go by, and 2 months after this stressful moment, the same situation happened again. I was playing Among Us, but changed my habits. I always looked at the window to see if the guy was going to be there again, and always made sure the door was closed. That's when I see the guy again. Although I'm stressed, this time I'm really scared because I'm home alone. I leave for 10 seconds, and suddenly I don't see him anymore. I tell myself he left. That's when I heard a big noise at the front door, so I deduce that it's been forced. I freak out. I take my phone, my keys, my laptop in my bag, and think about the situation. I open the window and go down onto the terrace, go down to the parking lot, and at that moment I hear another noise coming from my house. Then a third one. That's when I see the guy with the same object from before. Now I realize it was a knife. I run until I reach a friend's house and I'm exhausted from my sprint. He opens the door for me and I tell him what happened. In the meanwhile, I called my mother and the security of the area, and shortly after I see the same car make several turns and pass 4 times in front of my friend's house. When it came by the second time, I realized it was the man who had just broken into my house. I'd have thought he'd have come alone, but there were 4 people in that car. 2 years later, I have moved to a bigger city, and in an apartment in a quieter district. My boyfriend comes to see me often and I feel safer, but it always makes me fearful to think that at any moment someone could break in and do whoever knows what to me. It's something that has stayed with me all this time, but I'd rather not dwell on it. This happened in the year 2012. Me and my mum lived just ourselves in my grandmother's old house. After she died in 2009, it was just us. My mum had the habit of leaving the house and visiting family really often, since my entire family lived in the same town. Sometimes I would go with her, and other times I would stay at home and play games on the PC. One night in particular that I got home by myself, I can't remember if I was listening to music or the game, but it was almost 11 at night, and I had gotten a knock on the door. At the time we had 4 dogs that lived in our house, and all of them had started going insane barking. This isn't abnormal, as they would bark at the neighbours if they saw them out of our living room window getting out of their car across the street or heard anyone within a 5-mile radius talking. My bedroom happened to be at the front of the house with a window directly facing the porch and the door. Because of that, I was able to take a slight look to see who it was, and it wasn't someone who I'd seen before. My mum never had people come by the house often, but there had been a few that came over to talk to her or see if she was home. Not usually super late, but I ran with it and didn't think twice about it. I thought it was just one of her co-workers coming to see if she was home alone. I opened the door and was greeted with a guy who I'd say was in his early 40s wearing a brown work jacket and light blue jeans, so he definitely looked the part of someone who was working from the factory. I opened the door to see what he wanted, and he said something along the lines of, "Hey, how's it going?" and some small stuff here and there. It's hard to recall too much of the small talk, but he did ask something like, "Is anyone else around?" Or, that might not be entirely what he said, but it was along those lines. I was under the impression that at the time, he was the guy my mum knew from work, so I told him, "Yeah, right, I'm the only one here. My mum went to my cousin's house, but she should be back soon." He said other things like his name, and that he had recently moved here from Indiana, and he was going around to each neighbour's house saying hi and introducing himself, and I was like, "Yeah, around here that could get you shot, since it's not normal to show up to someone's house to introduce yourself, let alone this late at night." He told me, "Yeah, where I'm from in Indiana, it's normal for people to do that." He said his goodbyes and left. The car that had been running and sitting outside the driveway on the road looked like a decently new car, so I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured I wouldn't really have anything that the guy couldn't already afford, so as far as being a burglar, I figured he was in the clear. My mum got home about a half hour after, and I told her about it. It wasn't until her reaction to what happened that it sank in. I'd never seen the guy after the encounter, and I wasn't sure what he was after. My mum told me that I was lucky, that maybe the guy didn't barge in because all 4 dogs were right there with me, each of them pretty protective. They all kept an eye on the guy as we spoke. Maybe he was telling the truth and it was just a harmless encounter out of the ordinary. But from time to time I still think about it. Like, what exactly was he doing there? This happened when I was home alone. It was raining heavily outside, and I was sitting on one of the chairs looking out the window, and then suddenly I heard something walking on the floor above me. I thought it was just the sound of my mind creating because I was already scared of being home alone, so I ignored it. That's when about 5 minutes later I heard someone knock on the window. I thought maybe it was a bird who'd hit the window or something, but suddenly this huge floor lamp fell right in front of me. I sat there for 10 minutes trying to understand what exactly happened. The lamp was perfectly fine. I don't understand how it fell. It was definitely the creepiest alone moment in my whole life. When I was 17, I split my time between my mum and dad's house. One night when my dad was away, he travelled a lot for work. I was home alone. I liked to surprise him with a clean house, so I was vacuuming and it was around 9 p.m. Someone knocked on the door and I foolishly opened it, and a man was there and asked me if he could use our phone to make a call. I said no, but he persisted until I closed the door. I really didn't think much of it and continued vacuuming. A few minutes later, I hear a rapping on the back door of the porch. The same man is there waving at me, insisting to let him in. At this point I called the police, and they came and escorted me to my car, and I drove to my mum's house. The next day, when my dad was back, we discovered items in our backyard that had been moved around. The garbage and recycling had been gone through, and it was the same in the neighbours as well. I feel so naive for opening the door in the first place, but feel lucky nothing bad happened, as it very easily could have. Something really weird happened to me when I was house/pet sitting for my parents. Their house has always weirded me out. Lots of sleep paralysis, feelings like you're being watched. Nothing super scary, but enough that I never truly felt comfortable in this home. It was late, around 1 a.m, and I'm on the computer room, chatting with a friend on AIM. This was a long time ago, and suddenly all the electronics started going off. Both TVs turned on, the stereo system turned on at full blast, the microwave and oven both started beeping. It scared the ever-loving crap out of me. My parents' dog went berserk, barking, running up and down our lower main hallway. The stereo's volume was an old dial set to 1, the lowest setting, but the music was blasting out like it had been set to the highest. I turned off everything, practically run to my room with a dog, closed the door and ignored it. I think it was due to a power surge or something, but the stereo being at full volume when the dial was only set to 1 is something I have never been able to explain away. I've always been good friends with my cousin Cole, who is the same age as I. The two of us were not quite inseparable, but we always got along well enough together, and we were often found together, both in school, as we'd always wound up in the same class together throughout elementary and outside of it. When we were 12 and in the 6th grade, I was hanging out with Cole on a Friday afternoon, around the latter part of May, and we were both psyched at the start of the weekend. We wound up at his house since he didn't live too far from me, and at one point my mum called to say that our grandpa was in the hospital. While the issue with our grandpa wasn't expected to be life-threatening, he was being kept at the hospital overnight for observation, and both my parents and Cole's were planning on staying with him and grandma at the hospital since my mum and her sister, who were the two of their siblings, lived nearby. I was told that I was given the okay to stay at Cole's house for the night, with Cole's 15-year-old brother Hunter being in charge while our parents were out. This was fine by us. I got along well enough with Hunter, and he was never the bossy older brother/cousin that some of my other friends said they had to put up with. We ordered our pizza and enjoyed goofing off as boys that age tend to do. At around 9 or so there was a knock at the front door, and Cole went to answer it. I was a bit curious as to who would be knocking at that time, so I watched from a way back. At the door were two older guys. They said that they were with the city and were investigating reports about the water pressure supposedly being bad in the neighborhood. They asked Cole if his parents were home, and when Cole said that they were unavailable at the moment, which we were told to say to strangers if our parents weren't home, the guys started asking a bunch of questions about how the water pressure in the house was and if they could come inside to check. Hunter came over at that point and politely told the guys that the water pressure was fine and perhaps they should move on to check other homes in the neighborhood. The guys seemed reluctant to leave, but turned around and walked away after Hunter started closing the door. After the door was shut, we looked at each other and shrugged, but didn't think too much of it after that, and went back to goofing off. When we did eventually decide to go to bed, Cole and Hunter shared a bedroom, so we agreed that I'd sleep in there with them, rather than me hitting the sack on the couch or something like that, so that we could all talk while we fell asleep, and Hunter grabbed a sleeping bag out of the camping supplies for me. When we got to their bedroom, they stripped down to their briefs, and I remember Cole had mentioned to me once a while back that they had started sleeping in just their underwear. Since I hadn't originally planned on staying the night, I hadn't brought anything with me from home as far as overnight stuff goes, but since I wasn't in the mood to sleep in my clothes, I stripped down to my briefs too. Though I felt a bit embarrassed, even though we were all guys there, I knew they wouldn't say anything or be judgmental. They climbed into their beds and I quickly crawled into the sleeping bag, and after talking a while about random stuff, we eventually fell asleep. Early in the morning I got up because I had to pee, so I quietly got out of the sleeping bag and went and did my business in the bathroom. On the way back to the bedroom, I heard something in the family room, which was on the opposite end of the house from the bedrooms and particular bathroom I was using. I didn't pay too much attention to it at the time, thinking it must be either Cole or Hunter, until I go back to the bedroom and see them both in there asleep. Trying not to panic, I woke them up and told them that there was something going on in the house. They quietly followed me, and the moment we walked into the family room, we saw the two guys from the night before in there. It was rather clear that they were robbing the place. One of them started moving towards us as he pulled out a wicked-looking knife. The three of us promptly raced to the front door, somehow managed to get it unlocked and open, and we fled outside. As luck would have it, the cops were driving by at that precise moment. We quickly flagged them down and told him about the two guys in the house. The cops called for backup, and within a few minutes several other cops were there, and they proceeded to enter the house, and after some searching caught the two guys. The cops figured out that the two guys must have entered from a window in the laundry room that had a broken latch, and they had probably targeted the house because while it wasn't empty, they probably realized that there were no adults in there and figured that if we discovered them, we would be easier to deal with than adults. To add insult to injury, while we were waiting outside while the cops searched the house, both to get the two guys and make sure that there was no one else with them, some of the neighbours came out to see what the commotion was about, and this included some kids who went to the same school as Cole and me, including a few who were in our 6th grade class. It was during that time that the three of us realised we never had a chance to get dressed, so it was just like a stereotypical nightmare. We had to stand outside in full view of everyone in just our briefs for what seemed like forever before being allowed back inside. When we went back to school on Monday, Cole and I had to put up with more than a bit of sniggering, stares, and ribbing for the next few weeks until school ended for the summer. When I was 12 years old, my dad, who for most of my life had been a stay-at-home dad and looked after me, got a job that he had been pining for many years. Because of this, he was no longer in the house when I finished school, and for the first time in my life, I was handed my freedom and independence in the set of a keyring and one solitary key. The key to our house. At the time, I didn't realize how much of a big deal it was. I had suddenly been given the freedom to come and go from the house as I pleased. This meant that I would have to walk to school in the morning and make my way back completely independently, which I had never done before. A few days before my dad started his new job, he did a trial run with me, saying that he was gonna be behind me, but just make sure I got there alright, and then the next day, let me do it by myself. I had my cell phone in case of an emergency, but it was nice being given this independence, although a little bit scary. The story takes place on the first day that my dad started his new job. Anyway, I had left the house and my parents had already gone. I was lucky enough that my school was only about a 6-minute walk away, if that. I had to pass through a park, a children's playground, and then I was at my school. Super easy. It's also a very traversed route by many people, so it was about as safe as you could get, to be honest. I made my way to school, no worries. When school ended that day, I was making my way home. But a bunch of my friends who had already gained independence of their own and walked to their own homes said that they were gonna go play in the playground. Even though they were 12 like me, we all decided to go and have a good muck around on the swings and stuff. We had a good time for about half an hour, chatted as teenage girls often do, and then made our separate ways home. While we were in the park though, I noticed a man. Now we live in a relatively small village, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else, or is at least acutely aware of them. I had never seen this man before. Could he be new in town? I tried to put it to the back of my mind. It wasn't an important detail. What was important was food, as I was getting hungry, as it was nearing 4:30. So I start making my way back to my house. As I leave the park, there are 2 huge trees and a big metal gate that you have to open. As I opened the gate, I looked back, and the strange man who had been looking at us in the park was walking in this direction. I felt a chill creep down my spine. It didn't feel right. I was beginning to feel uncomfortable, and something in my gut told me at best to run the rest of the way home. It was a minute at most? And I ran down the few streets it would take to make it to my house. I listened when I got to my door and looked before I closed it fully, and when I did, observed through the glass in the door just to see if anyone was coming round, but no one seemed to have entered the road. I felt a sigh of relief. The man had not followed me, and I made my way over to the sofa after plonking my bag on the sofa too. I switched on the TV just for some background noise and proceeded to make my way into the kitchen to open the fridge to complete emptiness, realizing I'd have to prepare something for myself. Just as I was thinking about what I was gonna make, I heard something outside our house. I stopped in my tracks. I made my way over and muted the TV, but the noise had passed. Still, I waited to see if the noise would repeat itself or I would hear something else, but I didn't. I kept the remote on me at the time, just in case I needed to suddenly mute it. So I fixed myself a sandwich and made my way over to the sofa to start watching some cartoons. I was there minding my own business, munching down on my sandwich, when I heard another noise, a kind of scuffle from outside again. The TV was muted instantly, but again I did not manage to catch any further noise. I was starting to get freaked out, so I got my phone out and called my dad. It rang and went straight to answering machine after 5 rings. I was disappointed, so I tried my mum. Her job, however, is very intense, and she hardly ever has a chance to look at her phone while at work. I wasn't expecting her to answer, but when she didn't, I felt a pang in my stomach, like the hope had been kicked out of me. No other relatives lived in this area, so I didn't really have much of a choice. I didn't know who to call. I just sat there frozen. I was afraid of calling the police, given my age at the time, as I had been told not to call the police in case of an emergency, and I was honestly more scared of calling them up and being reprimanded for wasting their time. So there I sat, in silence, watching the images of the TV flicker in front of me as I waited, listening for the sounds. When none came, I slowly crept up the stairs, telling myself that I might be able to get a better view from upstairs safely to see if anyone is in the perimeter of our house. Now, I had to look around the side of our house first, which is where the noise came from on both times. I made my way to my bathroom window and gently poked it open, but it made a nasty creak when I did so. I don't think I made it to look down quick enough, because when I stuck my head out I saw nothing and no one and couldn't hear a damn thing. So I closed it. I didn't want to give, if anyone was outside, a way into the house. I slowly crept my way around each room. The bathroom, I had to open the window, because of the awkward angle, but in the other rooms I just had to look up and down in order to see outside. There appeared to be no one visible in the perimeter of the house. One thing I never checked though was the back garden, which to me was logical, as there's no way anyone could have gotten there, right? Wrong. You see, we just had a door that led to the garden, that was it. I suppose if someone with enough determination to get into someone else's garden really wanted to, they could just jump the door, which is possible, and something I had to do in my teenage years when sneaking back in, but that's beside the point. They could have jumped on one of our bins, over the fence, or door, and been in our garden in seconds. And I never checked. So contented at the time that there being no one there, I went back, unmuted the TV, and began eating, with relief washing over me. My parents still hadn't come back yet, and it was well past 6. I was expecting them soon though. The sky had already turned dark at this point, and I had turned off the TV and started doing my homework begrudgingly. I turned the light on in the study, which bordered the garden, and the moment I did so, I got the fright of my life. Peering at me from the window was the man from earlier. He was in the garden. The moment the light came on, he froze. I saw him, he saw me. He just about ran to the other side of the garden, but because there was a house on the other side of where our garden ended, there was nowhere he could really go. At that point, I fumbled to the other room to grab the phone and dialed for the police. I knew that this was an emergency now. A man was in the garden and he really shouldn't be there. And after calling, the man came up to the window and frantically waved his arms. I didn't know what to do, so I ran to the other room and hid behind the sofa. I told the lady on the line where I lived and that there was a man who had broken into our garden and to come ASAP. I was panicking, rocking back and forth. To make matters worse, at that very moment, I heard the back door open. You see, my parents never really had the habit of locking it, living under the delusion that people won't break into your back garden. Well, much to our dismay, we learnt the hard way. The man came blundering in, yelling at me to stop and hang up the phone. He found me in seconds, and I just started screaming. I hid the phone, I threw it under the sofa so that they could keep hearing the conversation, and I screamed, running around the house, telling him to get away. He was yelling at me that he wasn't going to hurt me, and he just wanted to know where it was. It, exactly, was never elaborated on. He started getting angry, yelling at me, screaming, "Where is it? I know you've got it." I don't know what he was talking about. He didn't look drugged up or anything, so I was getting increasingly more anxious and concerned. He ran into the kitchen and started throwing the drawers open. I could hear the cutlery being thrown everywhere. I was screaming louder than ever. He was screaming in return, returning my screaming kind, shouting, "Where is it?" at the top of his lungs. I was crying, I was sobbing, and I think I nearly wet myself in fear. I just hid in the corner of our dining room, trying to make myself as little as possible while crying loudly. I wasn't sure if the police were even still on the phone. Honestly, I thought that they'd hung up because I wasn't on the phone anymore, and that was sending me into even deeper fits of anguish. The man stomped up the stairs, shouting, "Where is it?" over and over again. But within a few minutes, I heard the police shout at the door. At that moment, I ran to the front door as fast as I could, didn't even bother to look at them, and fled and hid behind one of their cars. The police entered the house, and once they were inside, came back with the man in minutes. Safe to say that by the time my parents had been informed and the man had been put in the back of the car, my dad decided it might be best to wait a little longer before he let his little girl have the independence he wanted her to have. My dad decided to turn down the new job after just one day. Talk about terrible timing. and stayed with me for another 1.5 years until my parents felt ready again to give me the freedom they had done when I was 12. I never knew what happened to the man. My parents decided it best not to tell me, and honestly, I haven't pestered them since to ask, but I might just do that now. To the creepy man who was looking for it, and who stalked me and invaded my home, and who destroyed my sense of peace while being home alone, let's never meet again. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's collection of Home Alone stories, certainly a creepy one. I don't think I was really left home alone as a kid. Were any of you, and did anything spooky or creepy ever happen because of it? If there's something that you would like to share, I would love to hear about it, so be sure to send me your stories via email, link in the description. I'd like to extend a huge thanks to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen now. Thank you so much for the support, guys. You are amazing. But I'm going to wrap things up here. If you want to watch more videos, links can be seen on screen now. But until then, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.